Elaine. I want to support Peter Pry on his comments on the deep state. The deep state is a term that used to apply to people like me and Peter. And we're wearing our navy blue suits today and striped dark ties. I'll give you a clue. That's the uniform of the deep state. And I heard Peter introduced as a former CIA analyst.
Yes.
So the deep state is a big factor in what Orlean was talking about too, the support for migration and refugees and secularization of our schools and churches. But if I'm successful, my goal today is to scare you that the China threat is even bigger than the EMP threat or migration and refugees. I'm not sure that's true. Our country is split down the middle on China. Our Congress is split on China. The Trump administration is split on China. So a lot of paralysis is taking place. It sounds like when Peter said not one, if I understood you, not one single recommendation of the EMP Commission has been actually implemented. And you see that on China too. First of all, let me just ask you, how many people in the room have been to China at least once? Put your hand up. Okay, it's about half, I'd say. How many have been to China 10 times or more? 10 times or more? One? Two? Two? How many have been to China 85 times? Well, you're living there?
Yeah, I live there.
Well, I know you pretty well, so you don't count. You're like, you're equal to me as a China expert. Would you please stand up? Does everyone know you have a China expert here in your room? In fact, could I yield half my time so you would come up here?
No, you.
I was on the Trump transition team up in Trump Tower in New York. And there was an 84-year-old guy the president's very fond of. He made him Secretary of Commerce. And he has a very big say in what President Trump thinks and does about China. I asked him, his name is Wilbur Ross. He has a $20 million apartment on 57th Street in very close to Trump Tower. I said, Mr. Ross, how many times have you been to China? I was going to kind of put him down and show off. And he very quietly said, 84. And it's in the book, The Art of the Deal, when Trump was basically going bankrupt and his career was over. So that's the good news. We have a number of people in the Trump administration in the White House who know what to do. President Trump's chief advisor in the White House on China was a former Wall Street Journal reporter. The Chinese hit him in the face one time for covering corruption in a town near Wuhan in central China. That affected him. When you get hit EMP is very scary. 1177 BC, 600 years of darkness, but it's an abstract concept. If someone hits you in the face as a Wall Street Journal reporter, you remember it. And we've been joking with the Chinese. This gentleman's name is Matt Pottinger. He was in the transition team in New York as well. He's the president's right-hand man on China. So I've joked with the Chinese. I said, you better find the guy who hit Matt Pottinger in the face and turn him over to us. And I think they're actually going to do that, Peter. Now, on the deep state and moderate Republicans, they oppose President Trump's new approach to China. And one of the things, Peter, I don't think you mentioned this, but one of the deep state's weapons is leaking to the media, leaking to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And there have been a whole series of leaks over the last 18 months that are devastating for President Trump. The leaks describe meetings in the White House, in the Oval Office, where a kind of food fight breaks out between President Trump's advisors on China. And the Chinese read these articles. They also collect intelligence about the Trump administration. And it gives them great hope. Because the articles, many of which are on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the articles basically say there are a few crazy nuts around the president trying to start a trade war, have tariffs, criticize China, have naval operations in the South China Sea, or just what happened a few days ago, American bombers fly over the South China Sea. But these, thank God, these newspaper articles say, thank God, there are these great heroes who want to preserve the past 40 years of American policy and strategy toward China. So this gives the Chinese hope if they can just last until at least the midterm elections or 2020, they'll continue their strategy and policy. And let me just tick off in the remaining minutes, let me just tick off a few key points about their strategy and policy. The first thing, and this gets back to Orleans talking about churches and education, having to bring the Quran and wear a prayer rug, and that was a great story. The Chinese Communist Party is 85 million people, and it's an elite thing you have to do a lot to get into. They have an entrance exam process. You have to be watched for 5 or 10 years and make sure you're a good party member. And one of the things you have to do is go visit all the battlefields where Mao Zedong and his other generals and leaders fought and won and established communist China. Now that's millions and millions of students and older people going to these battlefields. And at the battlefield, Mao and his team are portrayed as gods who are inspired. By the way, there's no Christianity or any religion is allowed if you're one of the 85 million of the elite. So I went to see some of these battlefields, thinking the panda huggers, as I call them, the pro-China people, they told me all countries do this, don't get excited. So I saw these large numbers of students being taken through. They take an exam. The military officer corps of China has to go to all these important battlefields. There's a museum there, there's videos, there's mandatory examination. So I thought to myself, maybe the panda huggers are right. Maybe we do the same thing back in America. So I'm a member of something called the Society of the Cincinnati. It's not exactly deep state, but it's descendants of George Washington's officer corps. There was a Daniel Pillsbury at Valley Forge. So using that identity, I went to see our top 5 battlefields. You know what I found? Who said that? Stand up, that's, yes. They're dilapidated, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I don't know how this Eagle Forum stands on him, but in 1930, he gave an order. He said, Revolutionary War battlefields, in fact, all battlefields in America, really don't belong under the War Department, the Defense Department, and the military. They belong under the National Park Service. The people take care of Yellowstone and Yosemite. And that's what happened. Since 1930, I'll give you the examples of the 5 top battlefields. You go to Dorchester Heights in Boston. It's a pretty big deal. Henry Knox brings 59 cannon, surprises the British. George Washington plans the whole thing. The British sail away from Boston, never to return. It's a huge victory, psychological and in terms of military terms. What do you suppose is at Dorchester Heights today? Is there a big museum? Are we cycling through millions of students? Does everybody learn the story of the first great victory of George Washington? No, there's a little obelisk, and there's a high school nearby that I asked them, what do you do? The 2 students I was talking to never heard of the story. Then you move south. I'll skip Brooklyn. Well, no, I won't skip Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a huge battlefield. The entire American army of about 7,000 is surrounded by the British. It's the largest British expedition in history. They have to escape. George Washington personally loads everybody on boats to cross 20 times back and forth to get to Manhattan. You think there's any kind of memorial or Park Service visitor center or ranger there? I went there. The answer is no. 200 people gave their lives at one key point. They're buried under a Trader Joe's in an unmarked grave, which there's an archaeological team right now, privately funded, trying to find the bodies. Because why? Because this is not a Defense Department mission, it's a National Park Service mission. So they don't count as American soldiers. Everyone knows about Washington crossing the Delaware. Anybody been there? Where Washington actually crossed the Delaware? Almost 1 million people visit every year. There's no visitor center. There's 2 state-run sort of offices. How about 2 days later, after crossing at night and marching into Trenton, Alexander Hamilton, with Washington's first noticing him, sets up some cannon. They win the battle. They capture 900 German mercenaries. So I asked, well, where was Alexander Hamilton's cannon actually located? How did they fire these guns? And they pointed to a small piece of grass and a chain link fence. Don't forget the Chinese version of all this, what they do with their heroes, their founding fathers, and their battlefields. Surely you're going to say, well, what about Yorktown? What about Alexander Hamilton and Lafayette with George Washington a couple hundred yards away, taking what's called Redoubt number 10? Really famous. The British say that's it. That battle, midnight, 300 troops, that's when we lost the war. You can go to Redoubt 10 today. There's a little sign. It's sinking into the Potomac River. There's a big chain link fence. Keep out of this area. That's where most of Redoubt 10 is today. So back to China. If they have patriotism, this whole thing in China is called the Patriotic Education Campaign. If they have 85 million party members, you would think, well, no, China's rich and wealthy. This really is old China, don't worry about it. Who has more billionaires today? Put your hand up. Who has more billionaires, America or China? China. Oh, how many people? Aaron, you know the numbers? 585 Chinese billionaires, 540 American billionaires. How about GDP? We used to be told when the opening to China began, this is my last minute basically, isn't it? We used to be told China's economy is 10% of America's economy and has no prospect of growth. There's a wonderful declassified CIA estimate on China's economic prospects, which is very embarrassing for those who ever wrote it. It explains why the Chinese will never have any serious economic growth. So the idea, the fundamental assumption of our policy in those days, and that the panda huggers in deep state maintain today, China not only will not grow, it almost certainly is going to collapse. The best-selling book on China before mine was called The Coming Collapse of China. Inevitable collapse. So that's not much to worry about, is it? But actually, during the next 35 years, China grew at almost 10% a year. And what economists, a couple of Nobel Prize-winning economists said, this can't happen. It's never happened before in human history. So all of a sudden, China's economic size is almost the same as our own. In fact, by one measure called purchase power parity, the Chinese have surpassed us. Now, back to how many times you've been to China. How many times do you suppose the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, has been to China? You have one nomination, 0. Well, he just went 2 months ago, so you know it's at least one, right? Any more numbers? The Secretary of Defense, beloved, nickname Mad Dog, Marine Corps 4-star general, hundreds and hundreds of books he's read. A friend of mine saw him reading the 100-Year Marathon on the way to Beijing, on the trip. I said, what about that? He said, it's a very good book. So I got kind of an endorsement. But how many times has the Secretary of Defense been to Beijing? We got 4. Any more guesses? We got 10. We got somebody else saying 1. The press asked him on the plane, Mr. Secretary, thinking he was like Wilbur Ross, or at least, 20 times. China's a pretty big issue, wouldn't you say? How would you like it if the answer was none? This is my first trip. So our military's general attitude, in particular, Peter, the Navy, toward China, is this is a friendly, cooperative power as long as we treat them in a way that doesn't upset them. So the president has changed this, just as Peter said about EMP. He's changed the rhetoric in the national security strategy on China. The Congress is in some ways in the lead. There is a National Defense Authorization Act that passed, the president signed. It has a lot of things on China in it, but one of them is quite telling. It gives the Defense Department a time limit to write and submit to Congress, both unclassified and a classified annex, a comprehensive, all-of-government strategy toward China. You mean there isn't one now? And some of the senators who proposed this successfully, I had dinner with them in advance and said, this is my view. We are facing a bigger challenge than Islamic migration and refugees, or EMP, put together, because our world leadership is at stake, number one. It's an explicit Chinese goal now. Number two, we're asleep, largely asleep about China. Number three, they're deep inside our system. Yes. They're deep inside our system. We have advocates for China who are governors, who are mayors, who get Chinese money for their school system. Anything I say can be refuted by 100 or 1,000 friends of China in our country. I don't think EMP commission enemies, opposition or opponents, numbered in the millions inside our country. I could be wrong. I don't think the issue of Islamic migration has, maybe it's closer to China, but just massive support from inside our political system, our church system, the interfaith councils. My own church in Georgetown, they want to have interfaith discussions, and no one, until I heard you today, Orlean, I didn't even know what that was, but everybody's saying yes, and have interfaith discussions. The Chinese are far more advanced inside our system. In fact, now we're learning about a whole new operation they have called United Front activities, where someone comes and says, I'm an independent think tank scholar, and really isn't. Has a special message from the Communist Party leadership tailored to that audience. So in terms of trade, economics, the media, what do you suppose the chances are President Trump's new ideas on China will actually get implemented in terms of opposition? Well, I got 0. Aaron?
I remain hopeful.
Want to put a percentage number on it?
No, sir.
50%?
All right, I'll defer to you.
One piece of good news is John Bolton. The two previous national security advisors, I know them both very well. General Flynn tells many people China's not a problem. You know why? Because I have a brother who works in China, and if there's any real China threat, my brother would alert me. That's a quote. Then we have H.R. McMaster, kind of a good friend of mine over the years. Read his book, Dereliction of Duty, brilliant dissection of how you can lie to the president and get away with it, and then the president can lie to Congress, and it's not learned for 30 years. The subtitle of his book is something like The Lies the Joint Chiefs of Staff Told. It's dereliction of duty, the war in Vietnam. So I thought he was finished. I thought you can't be a West Point captain teaching at West Point and come out with a book like this and survive, but he did. Because a lot of the military who promoted him knew it was true. It's a disgraceful story about the war in Vietnam, what the advisors did not say. So that's my thesis for you. Take it or leave it. But I put the odds of President Trump's turning things around on China up in the 50% area. I kind of agree with Aaron that it's good to be optimistic. But when you have the combination of this support for China inside our government and inside the Congress, I remember 7 senators back in about April had a Senate Finance Committee hearing on China and the tariffs. The 7 senators, some of you are in states they represent, attacked President Trump one by one. This isn't Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer. It's our own Republicans. And they talk about companies who called them on the phone and said, oh, these tariffs. By the way, Christmas tree ornaments, the price is going to go up. But it's a kind of a tax to say if you want China to essentially replace us as leader of the world, these tariffs are the first time we've got their attention. Now they're denying everything. Their foreign minister just 3 days ago up at the UN denied that there's ever been any technology theft or forcible technology transfer by China, by the Chinese government. Maybe some companies have done this, you know. This is the heart of President Trump's case. We cannot afford as a country to lose what? Our technology innovation base. Common sense, right? But who protects the technology innovation base? Who's supposed to know that a high-tech thing just being talked about, maybe written on a napkin in Silicon Valley, is going to provide the key to a massive new global market? There's no commission on this, Peter. Nobody in the government's in charge of it. The FBI says in a very constructive way, this actually happened. Dr. Pillsbury, if you'll give us a list of the technologies to watch for, we will watch every Chinese delegation. Nobody has the list. We found the list about 2 years ago. It's called Make in China 2025. It's a list of 10 technologies with which China says we can dominate the world. We can get 60% market share of what's going to be a huge increase in global GDP. And that lays out a plan by which they would do it. This is why President Trump recently, and the director of the FBI, said, you know, there's 350,000 Chinese students in our country. They're mostly in technology and hard science as graduate students. Many of them go to laboratories every day. Graduate students do that kind of thing, get extra pay, and they see the newest technologies. Is it against the law for them to transfer this back to China? No. So do you want to lose the top 10 future advanced technologies in the world? That's the question President Trump is raising. And the second issue he raised, like my last point in my 25, I must have gone over 25 minutes. The last point he raised, he doesn't use this word anymore, but he used the word rape. China rapes our country. What he meant by that, as I had to explain to the Chinese, not literal, he meant the loss of massive numbers of high-paying jobs and the devastation of downtown cities like Detroit through 20 years of Chinese success. He said, that's not right. We're going to fix it. But the opposition to such a simple common sense concern is really extreme. And the irony is, guess who supports him? I know, they don't like it. The senators and congressmen who are from those districts, lots of whom are Democrats. So we have Debbie Stabenow, otherwise, you know, we could all hiss and boo her, progressive liberal, She tried to block the Smithfield ham deal. Moderate Republicans said this is fine. Smithfield Ham wants to sell the whole company and all the R&D and technology they learned from the federal government. Fine, let China buy Smithfield Ham. Debbie Stabenow, doing by some conservative Republicans, said, wait a minute. One of the few things we dominate besides aerospace is food product exports. Bacon and ham and that sort of thing. It's a really big international market. We're the leader because of the quality of companies like Smithfield Ham. You suppose she won? No, she lost. The deal went through. A whole bunch of deals like that, which President Trump is trying to crack down on, to know about the deals, which we usually don't, and to review them, and if necessary, to block them. So that's the big, I would call the big picture of what President Trump's trying to do, and based on Peter's bringing up the deep state, to hold that out for you, that your congressmen and senators' voting record can be checked. How do they vote on these different things? How do they feel about what China's doing and what should be done to stop it? And actually, you might be in for a big surprise, because often the progressive liberal Democrats are harsher against China because of pressure from the trade unions and people with lost jobs than your regular garden variety moderate Republican. So maybe we'll have a vote afterwards, Elaine, about which is the bigger threat.